welcome one and all. We're delighted to be able to welcome Matt Ridley to his inaugural lecture as one of our new group of visiting scholars. Matt obviously requires no introduction, but as I'm sure all of you will appreciate, we picked him for some very obvious reasons. His intellectual courage, clarity, and polymathic qualities being amongst them, and his lecture tonight, his inaugural lecture, will I know prove no exception and will not disappoint anyone for its stimulating, rigorous, and fascinating insights. So Matt, thank you for coming here. Thank you for honouring us thus. We look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you. Thank you, Dean, very much. You've got a lot of confidence that things are going to go well tonight, which I like, a lot of optimism. And just before I start, I'd like to point out that if an MP sidles out in the middle, it's not because I've said something wrong, but because there's a vote. They wanted me to say that. Yeah, there's a picture up there. To summarise roughly 500,000 years of innovation. I'll keep coming back to that picture throughout, and I might even draw a lesson from it at some point. But it's really there just so you don't have to look at me the whole evening. Thank you very much for this invitation to deliver this lecture. It's a huge honour. And I think what you're after is some idea of how we get innovation into party manifestos. And I've only got a few rather sketchy thoughts about that, but I think it's the beginning of a conversation that could be interesting. In my lifetime, the population of the world has doubled, but the average income of its inhabitants has trebled, in real terms, corrected for inflation, which means that total GDP has gone up sixfold. And I think there's another picture of that. How do I do this? Oh, no, sorry. There we go. So that's the world economy over the last 400 years. So the average person can acquire 6 times as many goods and services as a result of a day's work as he could 50 years ago. And the explanation for that is innovation. Not just invention, but innovation. The difference, in my view, is crucial. It's that one involves a single moment of change, the other means the wide dissemination of a new rule or tool to the benefit of many. So the jet engine was an invention, but budget airlines are an innovation. The communist world was quite good at invention, but it was terrible at innovation. And as William Baumol has pointed out, the market is vastly better at innovation than the state. Catch-up economic growth in poor countries may not require a lot of de novo invention, but it does involve a lot of innovation. Better roads, an electric grid, more rule of law, a new copper mine, a container port, a mobile phone network, that sort of thing. The National Endowment for Science, Technology and the Arts, NESTA, did some research recently which showed that 2/3 of the UK growth between 1990 and 2007 was the result of innovation. There's absolutely no way we in this country can grow out from under our current debt burden without a huge amount of innovation. It's the only conceivable comparative advantage we have. So the fundamental task of every politician should be to work out how best to encourage innovation. The opportunities for innovation have never been greater. I fully expect to live long enough to see self-driven cars and planes, personalised genetic medicine, widespread 3D printing, real-time health monitoring, and an explosion of what some people call collaborative consumption, allowing anyone with a spare room to become a hotelier, anyone with spare cash to become a venture capitalist, and anyone with spare time to become a coder. The richest countries are the ones that have adopted the most innovation. It really is that simple. Not for nothing does my favourite free market economist, Deirdre McCloskey, argue that we should not call the current system of the West capitalism, but innovation, because it's about growth through improvement in rules and tools, not growth through accumulation. You just don't treble per capita income by piling up cash or land or metal. Take air travel. Often thought to be an industry that's stagnated or gone backwards, at least in terms of point-to-point speed, since the 1960s, in sharp contrast to what's happened in communication. But in 1969, the average cost in the US of a flight on a Boeing 707 was 34 cents a mile, and there were 13 fatal accidents per million departures. In 2009, the cost was 14 cents, less than half, and there was 1 fatal accident per million departures, 10 times as safe, more than 10 times as safe. And that's because of innovation. It's not mainly because of invention. The jet works roughly the same way, and there's been no increase in speed, though there has been improvements in fuel efficiency. It's innovation in computers, in business organization, etc., that's delivered that change. So how does having something new raise living standards at all? In my view, money is a bit of a red herring. The key metric is time, how long it takes us to fulfill a need. My second favourite free market economist, Don Boudreau, looked up a Sears catalogue from 1982 and found that an average worker had to work for 1 hour, 50 minutes to earn enough to pay for a new pair of jeans from Sears in 1982, whereas today it takes only 41 minutes to earn an equivalent pair of jeans. Likewise, William Nordhaus of Yale made this calculation, which is that whereas it took 15 minutes on the average wage to earn an hour of light from a kerosene lamp in 1880, today on the average wage it takes about half a second to earn that much light from a compact fluorescent bulb. The less time you take to fulfill one need, the more needs and wants you can then fulfill, and the more people you can support in work by acquiring their produce. That's where growth comes from, and that's why innovation does not lead to overall job losses. Here's a lovely example on a video, which I hope somebody will now kindly play, of a time-saving innovation that requires no new materials or no science, just a little ingenuity. It's called the lever axe, and it's invented by a Finnish bloke called Heikki Kana. And you'll see him chopping some wood with a newly designed axe. And what he's done is he's designed the... There he goes. And if you notice, the axe ends up sideways at the end of each blow. And that's because it's eccentric. It's actually bent like that, which has the effect that it deliberately, its energy goes into splitting the wood away from the log. I bet you didn't expect to see something quite this low tech. And here he's at it again. He's going to make a whole bunch of kindling in about 10 seconds. Well, maybe a bit more than 10 seconds, but half a minute. There you go. We'll just go on long enough so you can see the shape of the axe in a couple of minutes. He throws all the logs out, showing how beautifully split they are. So I just love this example because it's, you know, it could have been invented any time, really. Sorry, here's the axe. I just want you to see the shape of the axe. There you go. See, and it's got this hook on the top so it doesn't bed in, and it just diverts itself when it hits the wood. That's all he had to do. Anyway, he's going to do it again. We'll just leave him doing that. So let's define innovation then as a change that shrinks the time it takes to fulfill a need. Notice that, first of all, this is a measure by which government itself doesn't have a great record. The most expensive product that anybody buys is government itself. And far from shrinking the time it takes you to earn your government, the time keeps going up. State-built infrastructure costs more than it used to, from nuclear power stations to roads. Health and education generally cost more for the same product than they once did. Planning permission takes longer than ever before. If we relied on the, we'll go on to the next slide. If we relied on the state to provide us with products, we would be going backwards. So the very first thing the government should do is get its own house in order. A relentless and determined pursuit of productivity improvement in the delivery of government services would be a great start. And the focus should be, I think, on time shrinkage, cutting the time it takes to get something, putting penalties on projects that take too long, giving rewards to ones that take a shorter time. There are some very encouraging noises from the present administration, but there is relatively little sign that the public sector bureaucracy is itself remotely interested in such a project. Again and again, you see it going on about the need to get things right, to take time, to make sure we get everything right before we put something in place. And I think that's the wrong emphasis. The civil service mostly sees innovation as a private sector issue, with government telling business how to do it. This is, of course, the blind leading the sighted. Even here, the encouragement of private sector innovation should be central to everything a government does. Instead of which, it's an afterthought, a ghetto for a minister with an interest in technology, and a subject that's all but ignored in election campaigns and in Parliament. In the House of Lords, we hardly ever talk about innovation. That's mainly because politicians and civil servants don't, in the end, have the faintest idea how to encourage innovation. To the extent that they think they do know, they are, in my view, in thrall to a long discredited theory that it's all about science. Put money into pure science and you'll get technology out of the other end of the pipe. As Terence Keeley has shown, ever since Francis Bacon fell for a piece of Spanish-Portuguese spin, we've thought of innovation as something that comes out of one end of a pipe if you put science in the other. Supposedly, Prince Henry the Navigator in the 15th century invested heavily in map-making, nautical skills, and navigation at a special school at his villa on the Sagres Peninsula, which resulted in the exploration of Africa and great gains from trade for Portugal. Bacon wanted to copy them, yet recent scholarship has exposed this tale as a myth, or rather a piece of Henry's propaganda. Like most innovation, Portugal's navigational advances came about by bottom-up trial and error among sailors, not by top-down speculation among astronomers and cartographers. If anything, the scientists were driven by the needs of the explorers rather than the other way around. Science is the daughter of technology at least as much as it is the mother. And I think that's still true today. Nearly all the improvements in technology and practice that enhance our lives tends to come from tinkering technologists at least as much as from thinking scientists. Universities are important to industry, yes, but mainly downstream, not upstream, for explaining and expanding what the engineers are finding out and for supplying well-trained minds, not for supplying spin-out businesses. You will often hear, by the way, that all sorts of technologies we take for granted would not exist but for inventions paid for by the state. The internet, wireless networks, the global positioning system, microelectronics, touchscreen displays, even fracking. Many of these claims turn out to be myths, or at least dubious cases. But even if some are true, it's hardly a ringing endorsement of state-funded innovation if it keeps inventing things and then relies on the private sector to innovate them so that we get access to them. Most people greatly underestimate the talent and energy required to turn an invention into an innovation. I think it's an echo of the old snobbery about trade. It's true of almost all technology it's true of almost any technology that has shrunk time and improved living standards, from spinning jennies to mobile phones, from steam engines to search engines, from ammonium fertilizer to the internet, from container shipping to budget airlines. The vast bulk of the innovation has happened in the private sector, in firms, not in universities, among practical engineers, not ethereal scientists, and by trial and error, not by the application of theory. Ask any great innovator how it is done, and he will emphasize the importance of massive trial and massive error. Art Fry, the inventor of the post-it note at 3M, which he invented to keep his place in a hymn book, said, "Innovation is a numbers game. You have to go through 5,000 to 6,000 raw ideas to find one successful business." And here's a little example of that. These are early designs for aeroplanes from the early part of the 20th century, and notice how very, very different they all are. The tailplane is different on each one. So it wasn't that somebody came up with the perfect design and everybody followed, it was that there was a huge amount of experimentation. In this country, we're astonishingly good at science. We've the second greatest number of Nobel Prizes, and we've had one in each of the last 5 years, so there's no sign that it's getting worse. But we are notoriously bad at turning them into industries. We file fewer patents than France, for heaven's sake. So let me run through a few of the key things that I think we've discovered recently about innovation before I come back to the policy question. The first is that it's incremental. It's an evolutionary process. It doesn't advance by leaps. It shows what evolutionists call descent with modification. The motor car, as L.T.C. Rolt once said, was sired by the bicycle out of the horse carriage. We invent the adjacent possible. One invention leads to another by a small step. The second point is that it's inexorable. Moore's law shows an extraordinary, steady progression downwards in the price of computing power over 50 years, or upwards in the amount of computing you can buy for a given sum. But Moore's law is only the right-hand section of this graph. As Ray Kurzweil has discovered, it's been going on for more than 100 years, through 5 different technologies, right from the start of the 20th century. There is no leap when you switch from one technology to the next. It's just a progression from the previous technology, from vacuum tubes to transistors, or from transistors to integrated circuits. The progress of computing was unchanged by wars, depressions, and booms. It ran to its own rhythm. Third, it is inevitable. The next step is ripe as soon as the last step has been taken. And this is exemplified in the well-known phenomenon of simultaneous invention. There are 23 people who deserve plausible credit for inventing the incandescent bulb before Edison. And Elisha Gray and Alexander Graham Bell filed patents for the telephone on the very same day. As Kevin Kelly documents in his book, What Technology Wants, we know of 6 different inventors of the thermometer, 3 of the hypodermic needle, 4 of vaccination, 4 of decimal fractions, 5 of the electric telegraph, 4 of photography, 3 of logarithms, 5 of the steamboat, 6 of the electric railway. By the time Google came along in 1996, there were already lots of search engines out there. Archie, Veronica, Excite, Infoseek, AltaVista, Galaxy, Webcrawler, Yahoo, Lycos, LookSmart. And those are to name just the best ones. Incidentally, the corollary of this point is that very few things get invented too late, with the possible exception of that axe. For instance, it makes sense that the wheeled suitcase arrived just when it did and not decades earlier. Basically, wheels were too heavy, porters too abundant, and airports too small before the 1980s, so that was about the right time for the wheeled suitcase to come along. The history of innovation, then, is massively parallel and characterized by endless priority disputes, which is partly why I think the patent system is unfair, a point that I shall return to later. The fourth point is that innovation is combinatorial, as every innovation is a combination of other innovations. As Brian Arthur has argued, every technology that we possess is actually an amalgam of other technologies. And my favorite example of this is called the pill camera, which takes a picture of your insides on the way through. And it came about after a conversation between a gastroenterologist and a guided missile designer. This is just as true of social innovation as it is of technological, by the way. Consider the fact that Amazon's warehouses store items randomly rather than by category. The computer keeps track of the exact location. This enables people who are putting things on shelves to put them in the nearest vacant space they can find, rather than having to search out the right space. And it prevents similar items being mistaken for each other, which is a new rule and a rather good one made possible by new tools. Innovation depends crucially on the meeting and mating of ideas. Whereas the axe in this picture is made of a single substance, the mouse is made from lots of different substances, plastic and metal and silicon and so on, and more to the point, it's a combination of ideas that occurred to different people at different times and different places, often thousands of miles apart or who didn't even overlap in time. And I've made the case elsewhere that just as biological evolution happens through the recombination of genes as a result of sex, so technological evolution happens as a result of the recombination of ideas through trade. Isolated societies have always shown far less innovation than those embedded in trade networks. Indeed, severe isolation results in disinnovation, as specialization shrinks with the scale of the market, just as Adam Smith argued. That's what happened to Tasmania when it became an island 10,000 years ago. Its inhabitants' technology grew simpler over the next 10,000 years. The great engines of innovation in human history have therefore been trading city-states. Tyre, Athens, Patna, Genoa, Amsterdam, London, New York, Hong Kong. Trade and innovation go together. Cities are disproportionately innovative places, because that's where ideas can have sex. This, incidentally, is why clusters are so important. As Terence Keeley reports, private researchers regularly swap proprietary information with rivals to a surprising extent. The government has rightly encouraged the emergence of clusters around certain locations, such as Cambridge, and around certain technologies, such as high-value manufacturing. But let's face it, Britain's greatest cluster is called London, and it's an incredible asset. London is seeing a high-tech, mostly internet boom at the moment that is the envy of much of the world. There are a host of emerging businesses that could be on the cusp of explosive growth, the likes of Dewdill, Funding Circle, Unruly, TransferWise. The shortage of talent is the biggest problem they have, as the gap grows between available skills and technology's requirements. A report by GfK in 2013 found that 77% of London tech businesses felt that they could grow faster if there were more skilled people available, with almost half saying a shortage of skilled workers was their biggest challenge. This is exacerbated by immigration restrictions, which continue to keep vital developers and experts out of the country. Take SwiftKey, a rising software company that is revolutionizing predictive typing. Its employees speak tens of languages, but it can take months for such companies to get through the visa process and hire skilled migrant workers. In the tech world, this is often too long. Innovation, then, is an emergent, bottom-up phenomenon. New technologies will emerge to their own rhythm in the places and at the times most congenial to them, and choosing the people to do the inventing of them. So we should let people free to exchange ideas and back hunches, and we will see innovation follow. So, too, will scientific insights. So the first and most important policy for technology is openness to world trade. The more you encourage people to mix and communicate, the more innovation will happen. However, it is also very clear that some places see more innovation than others. And here is where policy can make a big difference. The fact that innovation is inevitable should not be taken to imply that it is inevitable here. Far from it. Very few countries get to host the innovation flame and the first mover advantage that comes with it. History shows plenty of examples of countries that encouraged innovation successfully, America being the prime one over the last 150 years. Currently, Israel is the country that's most impressive in this respect. There's 30 times as much venture capital investment in Israel as there is in Europe, and 2.5 times as much as there is in America. Per capita, sorry, so not total. But of course, there are even more examples of countries that stifled innovation, like Shogun Japan, Ming China, Soviet Russia, Nehru's India. There are many, many more of the latter than the former. Innovative societies are always rare beasts. Stagnant autocracies have always been common. So the main policy lesson is simple. You've got to get the incentives right for the people who do the innovating. Don't try to pick winners. You'll end up picking losers. Don't try to subsidize innovators. You'll end up subsidizing cronies with the best political connections. And you'll probably set back the cause of innovation by letting them create barriers to entry. Don't try to forecast the future. You'll end up in industrial dead ends like interactive TV and memory chip consortiums instead of social networks, say. Instead, just set up a planning, tax and employment system that is simple, predictable and generous to entrepreneurs. Make sure the physical infrastructure is there, the rule of law is predictable, the bureaucracy is responsive, the tax system is reasonable, employment law is flexible, and then get the heck out of the way. How are we doing in this country? Britain is certainly an attractive place to do business in some respects. The rule of law is very predictable and stable and a huge advantage to us. We have comparatively flexible employment rules compared with most of our competitors. The availability of finance is pretty good here. Other factors such as infrastructure and planning are pretty awful here, but we knew that. And we better not get sidetracked by Heathrow this evening or anything like that. Finance is in good supply in this country, though it's generally more expensive than in the US for venture capital. Exit opportunities are too few, and there remains a valley of death which lots of small startups fail to cross between the startup phase and the big business phase. Things have definitely improved since 2010. We've moved up 3 places to 7th in the World Economic Forum's League table of technology assets, based on factors including internet use, telecoms infrastructure, cost of services, and the application of technology. The government's patent box is an excellent idea to make it much easier for entrepreneurs to cut through the thicket of patent brambles that entangles many entrepreneurs. I don't want to say a lot this evening about intellectual property beyond the general point that it is increasingly, I think, a hindrance rather than a help to innovation, as has been well explored by Michael Heller and Alex Tabarrok in their recent books. Most patenting is defensive rent-seeking these days. The Digital Opportunity, an independent review of intellectual property published in 2011 after being commissioned by the government in 2010, said that intellectual property laws have become hostage to special interest groups, lobbynomics in the report's words, and do not strike the right balance between protecting past innovators and promoting future ones. In parenthesis, what the heck are we doing giving my grandchildren royalties on my books just because it suits the Disney Corporation? We also need to change the culture with respect to failure. Successful innovators do a lot of failing. In Silicon Valley, a failure under your belt is sometimes seen by venture capitalists as a good thing because you've learned from it. Not here. And I'll come back to this point later. In the World Economic Forum's rankings of how competitive tax regimes are, the UK came 64th. Firms here pay about 35 pence in every pound in profits on corporation tax, property tax, and other levies. The one area where government could make quite a difference at a stroke is in the tax treatment of entrepreneurs. Currently, we are very generous to those who invest in startup businesses. The Enterprise Investment Scheme and the Venture Capital Trust industry help people if they put their capital gains into startup firms. They have to be, otherwise in this country we'd put all our money into housing. But the entrepreneur himself gets a much less generous and, just as important, much less predictable deal. For a start, the Enterprise Investment Scheme is not available to employees, which discourages them from having financial skin in the game. Instead, they get the less generous entrepreneur's relief, which applies after you've sold shares. And the enterprise management incentive allows companies to recruit employees with tax-advantaged share options. But it's a disappointingly mean scheme because all it does is tax under capital gains rather than income. Entrepreneur's relief is okay. It reduces capital gains tax to 10% at the moment. But it's something you apply for after selling shares in your business. You do not know in advance that you will get it. And because the rules keep changing, as one successful entrepreneur put it to me, Nick East, who's in the audience, I can start a business with one set of tax rules that is intended to benefit an entrepreneur, invest energy and resources and those of a team, only to find the goalposts have changed in order to punish a different segment of the economy deemed to be gaming the system. Improving tax systems such that individuals are incentivized to take significant personal risks in starting new businesses should be the game. The lack of certainty on tax status year to year is extremely frustrating. End quote. For example, the other day our esteemed coalition partners, the Lib Dems, came up with a wizard scheme to confine entrepreneurs' relief to those who hold 25% or more of a company's shares instead of 5% as now. And I think this is mad. As Nick East put it to me, Nick, by the way, is CEO of Zinstra and formerly of Kramer Systems, which is a successful British business that created some 600 jobs. All founders of aggressive growth startups assume that dilution will happen as soon as first cash investment comes into the business and will continue as the business grows and investment rounds are closed. This is fine, so long as everybody's working hard and is successful to drive the value of the business up. Hardly any will have 25% of the business on exit. A great example of this appeared in the US recently, the famous Box.com, whose IPO may make or break the current boom in Silicon Valley tech. And it filed to show that the highly entertaining 28-year-old CEO has only 5.7% of the company. Not because he hasn't taken major risks as an entrepreneur, but because he has. He's accepted cash requirements necessary to grow and has diluted himself at every round in the belief he'll be able to drive enough value in the process. Interestingly, the effect of the Lib Dem suggestion was to cause Nick's advisors to suggest that entrepreneurs should think about selling their company before the next general election. Obviously, they know something about the opinion polls that we don't. So I would encourage an incoming government in 2015 to do something about the imbalance between investors in startup firms and the founders of such firms. Above all, give the latter certainty. Don't leave them guessing their tax benefits while they're taking risks. Treat these guys like gods, or at least as well as their investors. However, there is another much harder problem for the government to crack: how to turn round our culture. One of the things that astonishes me about this country in the Victorian era is the enthusiasm with which it used to embrace change. It celebrated innovation, welcomed creative destruction, and saw the possibilities rather than the drawbacks of changing the world. Today, we are instinctively fearful about change. Our default position is to be suspicious of an innovator, if not sometimes disdainful. Europe has enshrined this pessimism about innovation into its very core principles. Indeed, it's in the law, through the Maastricht Treaty, that we must follow the precautionary principle. Well, the precautionary principle is inherently unbalanced about innovation. It weighs the risk but not the benefit of innovation. It weighs the risk of innovation but not the risk of not innovating. And it weighs the risk of new technology but not the risks of continuing with the old technology. The precautionary principle basically says, as my friend Ron Bailey puts it, never do anything for the first time. Gary Marchant and his colleagues have written, the precautionary principle may well be the most innovative, pervasive, and significant new concept in environmental policy over the past quarter century. It may also be the most reckless, arbitrary, and ill-advised. End quote. We see this everywhere. Europe's decision to turn its back on genetically modified crops was, we now know, an environmental as well as an economic mistake, leaving us more reliant on chemical pesticides than the rest of the world, and condemning much of Africa, which wanted to follow our lead to preserve its export markets, to much more malnutrition and environmental harm than would otherwise have been the case. Opponents of electronic cigarettes talk only of the absolute potential harm they might cause, ignoring the fact that they are getting millions of people to quit smoking, which is 1,000 times more dangerous than vaping. So they are saving lives on a massive scale. Opponents of mitochondrial replacement therapy, which is coming before Parliament shortly, have focused on fanciful fables about how the technique just might one day be misused, not on how it might alleviate the suffering today of people with really horrible diseases. The debate about fracking and shale gas has been dominated by exaggerated or phantom risks, such as the risk of contamination of aquifers, ignoring the real risks of alternative technologies such as wind, biomass, and coal. The debate about nuclear power has led to such a precautionary culture of safety as to stifle innovation and prevent cost reduction. Those who demand urgent action on climate change say that any cost is worth incurring to cut carbon emissions, even if the evidence begins to suggest that dangerous climate change is actually pretty unlikely, or even if that cost of action is greater than the cost of climate change itself, as is suggested by the latest IPCC report, even if the measures taken are unlikely to affect global temperature much, because the technology is very ineffective. And even if they don't actually cut carbon emissions, biomass burning in power stations increases carbon emissions. So I just don't understand why we're supporting it. While on the topic of climate change, it's worth pointing out that innovation is bound to be the solution. You don't have to take my word for this. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change itself assumes as much. Its lowest emission scenario for 2100, which is the green line in this chart, is the one with the most economic growth. It's the one in which the world is 10 times as rich at the end of the century as it is now, and in which the increase in the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere is so small that not even the most alarmed person thinks there's a problem. Its highest emission scenario is the one in which we re-accelerate population growth and hugely increase our reliance on old king coal, so that we're burning 10 times as much coal as today, which is not very plausible. But even in that one, the world gets 3 times as rich. That's the blue line in the chart. In other words, even the IPCC says that if we encourage growth and innovation, we will probably not have a problem. Yet the green movement, which is entrenched in Brussels, massively well-funded, subsidized by the taxpayer, and granted ludicrously privileged access to the corridors of power, is immensely suspicious of almost any innovation and is, on the whole, against it, except those few that it decides in its omniscient wisdom are all right, such as wind turbines, mainly because they involve going backwards to a 14th century technology. An especially hard-hitting report produced recently by George Freeman MP, I don't think George is here, but has concluded that the European Union's precautionary approach to biotechnology, both in agriculture and in medicine, is greatly harming innovation and condemning Europe to a backseat in the biotechnology revolution. Freeman writes, just as the genomic revolution is beginning to offer untold opportunities across medicine and agriculture to help generate huge economic, social, and political dividends for mankind, by helping to liberate billions from the scourge of insufficient food, medicine, and energy, the EU is developing an increasingly hostile regulatory framework which risks undermining Europe as a hub of technology. So an absolutely vital political priority is to tackle this precautionary bias and get back to proper cost-benefit analysis rather than hazard analysis, as Professor Ragnar Lofstedt puts it. We need an innovation principle. Did I get that the right way around, Ragnar? I nearly always get it the wrong way around. We need an innovation principle to balance the precautionary principle. As a group of senior European industrialists put it recently, we are deeply concerned by the negative impacts of recent developments in risk management and regulatory policy on the innovation environment in Europe. Our concern is that the necessary balance of precaution and proportion is increasingly being replaced by a simple reliance on the precautionary principle and the avoidance of technological risk. We see numerous practical examples across a range of technologies, from engineering to chemicals and agriculture to medical sciences. So we would like to propose the formal adoption of an innovation principle in European risk management and regulatory practice. The principle is simple, that whenever precautionary legislation is under consideration, the impact on innovation should also be taken into full account in the policy and legislative process. Well, I've gone on long enough. In summary, here are the few things that I would like to see a government promising to do in an election manifesto to encourage innovation. Make time-saving a priority throughout the public sector. Stop picking winners, or rather losers. Improve the tax treatment of entrepreneurs. And combat the precautionary principle with the innovation principle. Then get the heck out of the way. Thank you very much. Standing, because then people can see.
Matt's very generously agreed to answer questions. I'm sure there will be many of them. As usual, the House rule is no question too outrageous, as you have to state your name and organisation first. First question. Gentleman there.
Warwick Policy Exchange. I'd be very interested in the whole new growth theory. Took huge interest in the United States in the 1990s, and the tax credit regime that was developed and then copied by Gordon Brown. What do you make of it?
Well, I think Paul Romer, who, if you like, is the sort of founder of New Growth Theory, would you agree? That's who we're talking about, as it were. I think Paul Romer has made an enormous contribution by identifying that innovation is endogenous to the... that was the word that Ed Balls got into trouble for using, wasn't it? But anyway, is endogenous to the economy, and so I think Romer's ideas are spot on, and it's extraordinary, really, that we went through the last 200 years without really having a theory of innovation in economics. It was just this deus ex machina that Robert Solow said came in from the outside whenever you needed it, or didn't, if you didn't, even when you did need it. So I do think that on the whole, it's right. The theoretical stuff is right. But I think how to translate that into practice, clearly, some kind of encouragement of innovation is generally right. But I think there's a lot of, there's a lot of things that turn out to work or not work. I'd like to know, from you and others, what you think has worked well in America and what hasn't. I haven't studied it terribly closely.
I'm very skeptical.
Right. Alec.
Gentleman there.
I'm Alec Brewers. I'm in the Lords, but I'm a microelectronics engineer. Spent my first 20 years innovating. There's one issue I'd like to hear your opinion. I agree 100% with what you've said. You've said a lot better than I tried to say in my Reith lectures years ago when I pointed this thing out, that somebody isolated from the world and now that what you call this idea sex, if you're isolated from that, you can't go anywhere. The issue that I still see, though, is, and I've talked about 90% of progress being made by what I would call evolution and investment, rather than invention and revolution. But if you're going to innovate, you have to be doing it. So you can look at Japan and worry about its creativity, but Japan's been successful because it's been making a hell of a lot and therefore evolving it. So they were the first to really reliable cars, and they can do that sort of thing. Our mistake has been to let a lot of what we were good at fall away, so we no longer do it, so we're no longer in a position to evolve it. And I just like to get your feelings about how one tries to solve that problem. You've only got to look at the company that's absolutely the best at that is Rolls-Royce. You see, it's evolved and evolved and evolved. You call it innovation, but it's an evolution. It's solving one problem after the other. How do you get lighter turbines? How do you do this? How do you so you're solving always a known problem. It's not a revolutionary breakthrough ever. So how do we keep those the big base that we really need to give the base for the evolution?
A couple of thoughts, but first, before I say that, you're too modest, Alec, in saying that I said it well. The only reason I said it well was because I heard your Reith lectures some years ago. So, once again, ideas meet and mate. There's a negative side to solving the problem you talk about, which is to recognise that we've been far too reliant on, we've put far too much emphasis on the science base and hoping that it'll all come from biotech startups founded by professors who spin out of universities. And I personally think that is, to some extent, a red herring. Most of the businesses around Cambridge, as you know only too well, are not started by ex-professors, but moved there because they wanted to be near the professors, as it were. There is a degree to which, unlike, say, Germany, university sector has been too much focused on discovery rather than application, if you like. But that's a kind of negative point, because I'd hate to lose our wonderful tradition of discovery in this country, because it is a fantastic one, even just in aesthetic and cultural terms. In terms of how we keep an engineering industry, a basic industry going, several things have mitigated against it, I think, in this country. And one of them is the degree to which finance, in particular, and London in general, have dominated the country's economy. And that has meant that this engine, which has produced fantastic dividends, but has made it much harder for us to go on being a sort of Mittelstand German-like economy in the rest of the country. And to rebalance that a bit is what we're all sort of quite keen to do. But I remember years ago having a conversation with someone who was saying, well, where's the sort of basic industries that we really need? And somebody else just pointed out the window and said, look, it's advertising, it's songwriting, it's all this soft stuff that's going on in London. And actually, you know, with social networks, we're fantastic. That's an important industry that we are the sort of, we're already the Germany of, if you like. So there's an optimistic way of putting that. But I think all I've said is that I agree with your diagnosis and I don't know what the cure is. Sorry, I took far too long over the question.
Gentleman at the back in the middle. Name and organisation.
Simon Best, Policy Exchange.
You mentioned, you drew attention to the distinction between the private and the public sector, with the private sector being more innovative. Is just as important as that the presence or absence of competition? So we have private monopolies, for example, private water companies are monopolies, but they're not known for their great innovation. Whereas on the occasions where governments are subject to strong competition, so for example, the US-Soviet space race, or even time of war, the greatest competition between states, those tend to be periods of great innovation caused by that competitive pressure. And where governments have taken action to liberalize markets, so for example, liberalizing the European airports market, which is one of the things that allowed the low-cost airline innovations that you mentioned, that's been an effective way of stimulating innovation. So would you add liberalization of markets, promotion of competition to your list?
Absolutely, and you know, my problem with government is not that it's government, but that it's a monopoly. You know, it suffers from, it's just as bad as a private monopoly, if you like. And I think that's an acute diagnosis. And you know, Paul Romer, to return to him, has this idea that we should have competition for government, because what he says is we should deliberately carve out enclaves and set up Hong Kongs in Africa and places, so that governments look over the border and say, help, you know, all my people are going to that place, I better do the same. So you get a bit of competition going in that way. It may not be practical in geopolitical terms, but it's an interesting idea.
Gentleman at the very back, standing there.
Thank you. Edward Stringer, Royal Air Force. We've had a couple of innovators in our history. I'm thinking of Frank Whittle, who joined as a boy entrant, an apprentice, commissioned very early on, then sent to Cambridge University, and then given the freedom to develop. So from that, two questions. Do you think there's a role for government in promoting social mobility to make the most of our human capital? And secondly, is there still a role in promoting some of that research? I know what you said about it's not all about the science, but some of that research where there might not be anything that comes out of it, but there just might, and it would be hard to get commercial backing.
Yes, I think with both of them, yes, there is. You know, undoubtedly, to find these humbly born geniuses who do extraordinary things, you know, George Stevenson in a previous century, same sort of story, is very important, and government can play a role there. Although, I mean, it didn't play a role in George Stevenson's story. Obviously, the Quaker bankers found him, as it were. Your second point was, sorry, I've gone and forgotten it.
The investment in some of the very base scientific research, and you said it doesn't automatically follow, but nevertheless hard to get back into stuff. But the graphene from the chap who also won the Ig Nobel early years.
Yes, exactly. Well, I certainly think that we should fund science for the beauty of science and without a thought to what it might be applied into tomorrow. You know, we should be funding neuroscience to understand the brain without any real thought that it's got to turn into a product tomorrow. And I think there's far too much emphasis at the moment on you know, how could you apply this science. We should be funding basic science because, as you say, it will throw up interesting fields, but also just because it's the most wonderful cultural achievement. It's like funding arts. You know, I mean, it's an amazing thing to do, to find out how the brain works or how the genes work.
Clean up with the back benches at the very back. There's a lady at the very back, and then I'll move to the front gradually. Please be patient. Name and organisation.
Lizzie Knoll from the Department for Education. I just wonder on the point of getting out of the way, whether if BIS, the Department of Innovation and Skills, if it was closed tomorrow, would that be a good or a bad thing?
I think when my uncle was Secretary of State for Trade and Industry, I think that was his ambition, wasn't it? I can't remember. I don't know enough about what BIS does, but my instinct is you might be right.
Lady at the back on the other side.
I was struck...
Name an organisation, please.
Oh, Ruth Porter from Policy Exchange. I was struck by your comment about how Britain used to celebrate change. And it does seem to me that that's one of the key cultural kind of forces at the moment, that in some sections of society people are really fearful of globalisation, and there's been a kind of parochialisation of Britain that's happened in response to that. And I think innovation, as you talked about, the impact on that is just one example. And I was just interested to know what you thought about how that cultural trend can be addressed, because obviously, you know, that's a very difficult thing to, those are very felt, very real concerns for people. How do you actually go about making people feel that change, that they can be safe within change, and that change can be a desirable thing?
I wish I knew, is the short answer, Ruth. I mean, you know, blow up the BBC would help, but you know, we won't go down that route. I'm very interested by how America is developing at the moment, because, and there are others here who know America better than me, but my impression is that 15 years ago, when I published a book about genomes and went around talking about it, in this country people would say, oh my God, does this mean that one day the government's going to want to read my genes? Whereas in America, everyone would say, oh, does this mean that one day I can read my genes and do something with it? You know, it's a fascinating difference. They would ask the same question, but from a completely different perspective. And I think that's faded, that difference. I think the degree to which America is turning, at least on the coasts, not in the middle, but on the coast, is turning pessimistic in a European way is really quite striking. I may be exaggerating it. So we need to study it to find out how it's happening and where it's coming from. I mean, in the end, you've got to shower people with the right incentives. You know, it's amazing what, how happy we are to adopt the mobile phone, for example, without a backward glance, because we can see the use to which we can put it. Whereas our attitude to GM crops was, well, that's for the farmers, so it's no use to me. So translating the benefits into personal rewards makes a lot of the difference. But you know, it's partly because we're getting older, it's partly because we're less confident as a society. I don't know, how do we change it? I'd love to know the answer.
The questions and the answers are getting ever more radical, so I'm going to keep trying to escalate things. The gentleman there has been waiting very patiently. You. No, the next gentleman next. You.
Ragnar Lofsted, King's College London. Thank you, Matt, for a great talk. One concern that I have is that in Europe, member state countries promote their own pet risks at the expense of Europe and innovation as a whole. Sweden is highly anti-chemical. It wants to phase out all human-made chemicals by the year 2020. It's insane. I'm Swedish, by the way, but it is trying to do so. Sweden can afford this. It has no chemical industry. Similarly, Austria is highly anti-GMOs. It has total GMO-free zones. Austria does not have Monsanto. All these anti-chemical and anti-GMO policies are being promoted in the European Parliament, and as a result, it's also anti-innovation. Don't you think that the UK should be more active in promoting evidence-based and risk-informed policymaking in the European Parliament? Maybe the Policy Exchange could have the next meeting there.
Excellent idea, and I think, Ragnar, you and I are arranging such a meeting, aren't we, quite soon? Not in Brussels, but here to get the conversation going. I'll give you another example, which is everyone else wants a financial transaction tax because they don't have a financial industry, and we do, you know. So I think it's interesting the degree to which, instead of common policies emerging from Europe, people are, as it were, using Europe to pursue their own pet peeves. Snus. Do you use snus?
Yes, snus is very Swedish. I don't use it myself.
It's just this tobacco that Swedes put under their front lip, which has resulted in far lower lung cancer rates in Sweden than the rest of the world, because they have much less smoking as a result. And the interesting thing about that is that they had to join the European Union, you had to get an exemption so you can sell snus in Sweden but nowhere else, because people might survive elsewhere, which would be a terrible thing. Sorry.
Lady there, name and organisation.
Helen Rombo, Prospect Wealth Management. As a current example, Astra Pfizer. To me, I'm astonished that the Prime Minister should even comment on it and what's been going on there. Is there a question there? Because I imagine what your answer would be. It just seems to me it's the acme of what goes wrong when things get big, or rather, it doesn't show innovation. It's the commentary about trying to stop the merger or whatever is government getting really in the way. And for a long time, Astra's been priced at 30 quid, till there was a bit of a sniff that somebody else might find it attractive. But honestly, I'm just astonished.
Yeah, I mean, innovation in the pharmaceutical industry is a peculiarly troubled concept because it's failed dramatically in the last 10 or 20 years. And these giant companies set up to produce these pipelines of drugs, just having an unbelievably low success rate and having to find more and more desperate ways of getting it, either by acquisition, which is the Pfizer strategy, or by acquisition of small biotech companies, like which is kind of the way some of the others are doing it. And you know, in the end, this is just all about that. I think is that, you know, here's a big quoted company.
I mean, really, the system should allow creative destruction.
That's right. I agree with that, and you know. But that doesn't necessarily make me against this takeover, because although Pfizer probably will mess this around and not achieve much with it, etc., and it's now pushed the share price of Astra up to the point where it can't afford to keep its promises once it buys it and all that sort of thing, you know, and that's one of the problems of these capital markets we have, which I don't think are necessarily always the best way of doing things compared with other things. Nonetheless, we mustn't put off companies coming here that innovative small companies can sell themselves to, that people can recruit into, etc., etc. So, you know, if we get all nationalistic about this, we will do too much harm to ourselves. I quite agree with you about senior politicians not getting involved. I think that was a mistake.
Gentleman there in the middle.
Hi, I'm Marcus Payne. I'm an IFA. I work in London. And on what I've noticed in the 20 or so years I've been in this sector is the innovation in the VCT and EIS space seems to go into how can we make things more and more secure and take all the risk out of it. And while there are companies like Oxford Capital Partners based in Oxford that focuses on innovation, they're the exception rather than the rule. And a lot of them are trying to... I wonder how you can get the people who are innovators away from the financial structuring and into the innovation or technology businesses.
Yeah, I quite agree with you. The VCT industry has gone down the route of sort of, you know, wind power VCTs or whatever, you know, and on the whole, actually Nick might have good views on this, is the wrong side of it. It's dealing with relatively mature businesses. It's not actually doing enough to help these small startups across the chasm of death or the valley of death or whatever it's called. And I don't know enough about how to change that, but I think that is an issue that needs addressing.
Gentleman there in the front. Yeah, in the front.
Chris Belk, Chairman of Conservative Transport Group and an ex-IT innovator. Would you like to comment on the possible role of the use of social commerce technology in harnessing the release of innovation within large companies?
Yeah, I think there's something really interesting going to happen here. In other words, that the social network industry is going to find really interesting ways of reorganizing the world, and I'd be a fool to try and predict them because everyone's very bad at prediction. But I'm fascinated by the way in which you can crowdsource solutions to problems. You know, if you've got an engineering problem, you sort of put it out there, either within a big company or even just out there in the world, and say anyone got a bit of time to contribute to that, which is going to get people collaborating in a really interesting way. and yeah, I had another example of something I was going to mention. I've forgotten what it is, though. But yeah, I agree with you. I think we've got to be alert to extremely unexpected ways in which. Yes, I know what I was going to talk about, which is the Google thing that you can spend. If you're an employee of Google, you spend 20% of your time on your own projects, and given that innovation is an evolutionary process that emerges in a bottom-up way. Good firms are going to recognize that and try and be bottom-up within themselves. I mean, firms on the whole are not bottom-up organizations. They have an imperial chief executive that tell everyone else what to do. But they're going to have to be. And you can see to some extent that firms like Google are trying to do this, or have been trying to do this. And they will tend to succumb to the top-down view of the world and then become stagnant, large behemoths. But they need to try and resist that.
It's amazing how many good ideas you get when you see you walk the floor and just talk to people walking the floor.
Management by walking about, exactly. Yeah.
Definitely that. Yeah, in the aisle.
Charlie Hamshaw-Thomas from E-Lights Electronic Cigarettes. Matt, as you know, we totally and utterly agree with your comments about the precautionary principle. Only two observations, picking up on what the lady from the Department of Employment said. Education.
She is Department of Employment.
Okay. And the gentleman there from the University College. Are there two big things that I think there are two big points to make, is the professionalization of politics and a lot of people in government that one speaks to who don't necessarily understand business in the same way that you do. And the second point is the size of the state, and a lot of people there who are innately, the precautionary principle will never go away while you've got a government and a state as big as you've got.
I don't disagree with either of those. Someone like George Freeman, who's worked in biotechnology, etc., is a great asset to a government, and it's great to have people like that. But the illusion that politicians are in charge of this gigantic bureaucracy is one that, well, it's an illusion.
Gentleman here caught my eye.
Thank you. Bruce Tavasolian, Respublica. Thank you very much for a very informative speech and a very informative talk. I was just wondering, pertaining to what the lady was saying previously about tackling the various mindset and the skepticism of globalization and whatnot, this pretty much feeds into that. There are a series of articles by a New York Times journalist by the name of Michael Goodman, and he was talking about the largely detrimental effect of new technologies. He's referring to what Keynes referred to as technological unemployment. There were a series of articles that Michael Goodman wrote, basically, and he was talking about how the use of the innovation of these new technologies has very much resulted in a declining of the labour force, talking about how the new technologies can result in 545,000 new parts pertaining to welding, whereas the labour force could only implement 445,000 parts. So I was just wondering what your thoughts were on these particular articles and this, mindset in general. It pretty much ties into what the lady at the back was saying previously. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. This technological unemployment. In other words, are we about to get so automated that there's going to be nothing for human beings to do? I was amazed to find how widespread this view is in Silicon Valley last time I was there. There's an awful lot of people who say, yeah, the singularity is near, and when it comes, there's going to be a disaster because everyone's going to be unemployed. People said that about agriculture, and they said it about manufacturing, and they're now saying it about services and things like that. The point is that it's a wonderful thing that we don't all have to go and do boring jobs for us all to have good lives, that we can make robots do it for us. Sure, there are issues of temporary dislocation, as when you close down in labour-intensive industries in certain areas and you get a problem of how to re-employ people. But we will work shorter hours. I'm sure we do that. We are increasing holiday time, we're spending more time in education. So we have this short burst of work in the middle of our life when we work about 35 hours a week for a few years. and then we can live off the rest. What's wrong with that? Sounds great. And, you know, look at the employment numbers. In this country, we've brought millions of women into the workforce. We've shrunk manufacturing to a tiny, you know, whatever it is, 18% of the workforce or something. We've shrunk farming to 2 or 3%. And yet we've got more employment than ever before, more people in jobs than ever before. So I simply don't get this. It just seems to me an old fear that goes back virtually to the 18th century, actually, that new technology creates unemployment. You know, we'll always think, I mean, we'll have more actors, we'll have more people to groom our pets. You know, there are all sorts of things that we can think of to ask other people to do for us, if we don't have to stand looking at boring machines all day.
A couple more questions, then I'm going to wind it up and just see who was trying to catch my eye. Gentleman at the back there.
Nico MacDonald, co-author of Big Potatoes, the London Manifesto for Innovation. Much of what you've argued, Matt, as you'll know, is very much sympathetic to Big Potatoes' perspective. And it's nice to have some allies, I have to say, since we've been banging on about this since the last election. Just a slight disagreement, Tech City, or whatever we call it, Silicon Roundabout, which I've been involved with for many years, is actually much more about creative technology than it is high-tech or creative industries per se, which I think actually is something Britain's got potential strengths in. We need to talk more about that. I think your innovation principle against the precautionary principle is something which is a very important thing, and to put the benefits against the possible externalities. I'd just suggest 3 other things that I either disagree with or think you should consider. One is leadership, because I think while government should get out the way, times that have been great periods of innovation have been times when political and business leaders have had hubris and ambition. And the argument we give is Kennedy, many people give that argument, and the space race, and the sense of the endless frontier, and making a culture in which people aspire to do better and imagine better futures. The second is humanism. So actually I think a lot of the narrative today is around humans as being a problem, as being consumers, as being polluters. And often our living standards come second to other things, precaution, the environment, and so on. And actually we're trying to redesign human behavior, right, nudging, etc., rather than progress, and arguing that wealth doesn't make you happy. Well, what an amazing insight that is. Well, it's a necessary but not, you know, not sufficient element of human, you know, realization, but it's the sort of thing that rich people say to people who don't have enough wealth in a self-satisfied way. So humanism and wealth. And the third one is problem solving. Actually, humans are brilliant at problem solving, as you've illustrated. And it's amazing with all the potential solutions we have to things at the moment that we only see problems, we don't see solutions, and we don't see humans as the agent of solutions. So those are 3 things, some disagreements and some which I hope you'll be sympathetic to.
No, that is a really helpful, thank you. I mean, who was it who said that, why do we regard the birth of a calf as a good thing? The birth of a baby is a bad thing in the developing world. You know, it's an extraordinary, you know, a baby isn't just a mouth, it's also a pair of hands, you know, as it were. So I think there's a lot to that. I'm not completely convinced about leadership. I mean, I think I'm all for, you know, admiring James Dyson or whatever, you know, and celebrating innovators. But do I really think that, I mean, Kennedy, you know, inspired a bureaucracy to do something quite, but it didn't actually lead to much in the way of, you know, landing on the moon didn't really change the world. It didn't even lead to the non-stick frying pan. That's a myth, apparently. WD-40, really? Okay, well, there you go. Was it really worth it for WD-40? I mean, it was worth it for other reasons, in my view.
Mine was a broader cultural one about creating an aspirational environment.
Well, yeah, back to Ruth's point, I'd bring this back to the BBC. You know, why can't we occasionally celebrate innovations on the BBC instead of talking about how they might do harm?
Peter Day does.
He does, that's true. Good, yeah.
One more question, do I see anyone's hand up? Anyone's hand up? Gentleman in the middle there. Yes, give him the search, please.
It was interesting to hear you mention the valley of death between the sort of discovery of an invention or potential innovation and its application and then commercialization as a big problem. Have you had any thoughts on how this problem could be addressed, especially considering that the government is not to pick winners, as you say, and such projects may find it difficult to obtain finance or capital?
Well, I think tinkering with the rewards to entrepreneurs, and I might just ask Nick East if he wants to comment on it, because I bet he'll have a good thought.
Yeah, so I mean, also partly to the previous point about VCT funds. So the value of death typically describes that stage of a business where you have a growth proposition that you can't sustain the working capital to grow. And fundamentally, I think being backed, as our business is, by a VCT business here in the UK, I think that situation has improved with the tax incentives for investors. So I think that's improving. There needs to be more competition in capital funds, particularly at what we call Series A and Series B. A lot more investment has come in because of the tax benefits in EIS and CDIS from angel investors to get people going. That valley of death is typically now around this kind of Series A financing rounds. But I would still say the big problem for us is going back to this culture. There is an issue. I mean, I've certainly pitched a lot of venture capitals for fundraising, and they do want to de-risk their investment. And in the UK, you have organisations, VCs, who are looking to absolutely minimise the risk. And in the US, you have people who are prepared to back a bold idea. And maybe also to come back to the point which hopefully was well made, that actually the people who are taking the big risk here are the entrepreneurs. People who are putting their professional and personal careers at risk for a number of years, only to hit that valley of death and find the business coming to nothing. So I'm fairly optimistic in terms of investment in the UK. I think there's a good angel and increasingly good VC environment, albeit the price of that capital is much higher than in the US. And when I talk to US VCs, there is currently a culture of, well, we have enough in the US, we have enough startup business in the US, why should I invest in a British company? Explain to me why it's good to be British, which is a hard thing to get across.
Matt, final word.
Thank you very much. Is that a good idea? Or do you want another speech?
I'm sure everyone will